Hey guys, and welcome to video 2 of week 2. And in this video we're going to be talking about the second step of 6 for designing our databases, which is subdividing each data element into its smallest useful component. And so we're going to jump back into our customer invoice example, and basically let's start by splitting up our data elements into basically buckets. So we'll have a customer bucket, which is going to have name, address, phone number, vehicle, VIN, and then we'll have a part bucket, which is going to be part manufacturer, part number, part quantity, part unit price, and then we'll have a work order bucket, which will have a work order number, technician, total labor hours, and tech comments. And so for right now, let's not worry about these other two. Let's mainly focus on our customer bucket. And so let's look at the first data element inside of our customer bucket. And when we're talking about dividing into the smallest usable component, we want to look at the data and think about, are there multiple components to that piece of data? Is there one component? Is the component more useful as multiple components or together? And so let's take name, for example. Well, with name, we can actually translate that into two separate basically data elements, which would be first name and last name. And so with our address, the same thing applies. Because with our address, maybe we want to retrieve the data as just the street number, or just the city and state and zip code. And so we can break our address up into street number, or we'll just say street and number, or what do we want to call this? We'll say street address, city, state, zip. Now, what about our vehicle? So our vehicle, as listed up here, contains, I would say, maybe 5 separate components that we might even want to combine with VIN into a completely separate bucket. And spoiler alert, when I say bucket, I mean table. But we might even want to split that into a completely separate bucket called vehicle, and that's going to have make, which is going to be our Ford part, model, which is going to be our Mustang part, year, color, we'll throw submodel in here as well, and VIN. And so when we start thinking about our data and subdividing, we want to first look to see, just in summary, if there's more than one component to our data element, and if there is, we have to think about, is it more useful as a separate component or an individual component? And part of that requires thinking about the future and thinking about how that data element may be used in the future. So for example, with name, so we have to think about, so say I wanted to be able to pull a customer's first name and not their last name. Well, it's a lot easier, or it would be a lot easier on your end, on maybe an end user of the database, maybe a developer or a DBA, to pull just the first name versus pulling the first name and the last name and splitting that. Same with address. So say we wanted to pull all customers from the city of Cincinnati. Well, if we have subdivided our address component into street address, city, state, and zip, now I can just pull all of that data back where the city matches Cincinnati. Generally speaking, it's somewhat difficult to predict all the future use cases of the data. So generally speaking, we want to subdivide as much as possible. But ultimately, it's at your own discretion. And then the last thing I want to talk about with the subdivision is that, when we think about the future, maybe we're worried about dividing too much. The nice thing is that when we start getting into SQL views and things like that, or even just plain SQL, queries, even if we've over divided our data elements, it's a lot easier to, or it's very easy to rebuild those data elements where necessary through concatenation. And so those are the things that we have to consider when we start subdividing our data elements and start thinking about structuring them as tables with rows and columns. So that is it for video 2, and we'll jump into video 3 shortly.